Hi, everybody. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Monday, January 6th, and I've gotten a number of emails from people asking me what to do if you're freaking out about the upcoming eclipses, about the upcoming Saturn-Pluto conjunction, how to deal with existential or astrological anxiety, depression, or fear in the face of seemingly negative or heavy transits. I had so many people write to me about this in the past week that I thought it would be good to do a video about it. So that's what I'm going to do today. Along the way, we are going to look at two previous horary charts, which I did demonstration videos on last year in 2019, which I've recently gotten the results of. So we're going to look back on a few horaries. And the reason that we're going to do this is to demonstrate a couple of heavier karmic events and predictions that came through these horaries and the results of them, as well as how or what each person that received these predictions and went through the experience of living them out maybe got from the experience. So we're going to do that. And then coming through those examples, we're going to talk about some of the ways of working with or working through just some of the heaviness that we might feel in the face of heavier transits, especially during eclipse season, especially as Saturn and Pluto are coming together and war may be imminent. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. All right, so to start with, I'll just read you something that came from one of my, one of my viewers in particular. I was wondering if you ever feel anxious learning about transits. When I listen sometimes to these things, she says, what I hear makes me feel depressed. How do you deal with these feelings? So there it is. And I got some version of that same question in probably 6 or 7 emails in the past week. And so I thought, okay, it's, when that comes in, I always sort of take it as a sign that, it might be time to talk about something. So let's look at the two charts that I was telling you about just a second ago. Let me put them up on the screen. And I'm going to start with the simpler of the two horaries, which is the story of a young man. And I think I told you that he was concerned about his father. This came up, I don't know, I think this was a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now. It might have even been in November. I don't remember, but he was concerned about his father's health. His father had gone on a business trip, and he had suddenly fallen ill very unexpectedly on a business trip. And he had asked the question, if it was how things were looking, and if it was possible that his father could die, because it was sort of rapid onset. They didn't know what was wrong. They ended up finding cancer. You probably remember the story. And and what was interesting about this horary, if you watched this episode that I did, you remember that there were actually 3 different charts that came up because we kept getting the wrong time. And even though we kept getting the wrong time, the same answer that it looked as though his father's passing was imminent came up. So here is how we judged it in this chart. This is a horary chart. Horary, the word horary means of the hour, and the basic premise of horary is that an astrologer casts the chart, the birth chart, for a question that is asked by a client, a querent, someone asking a question. And at the time that the astrologer receives that question, say in your email inbox, in my case, the question will be put up to the heavens and a chart will be cast for that time and from the location of the astrologer. Then there's a series of techniques that are used in order to ascertain the answer to the question. So in this case, the young man is asking about his father, and his father is going to be given the planet that rules the 4th house, which is the house of the father. So in this case, his father is going to be given the planet Saturn. So I'll draw this right here so you can see it. So here's his father's planet in the horary. And then we want to look naturally to the house, the 8th house, which is the house of death, to see if worst case scenario, death is a possibility. In this case, the ruler of the 8th house of death is going to be Venus. So we'll just put a little diamond around Venus there, which is the planet that represents death in this picture. Right away, we might notice in this horary that it's pretty unfortunate that a malefic Mars is sitting right on the ascendant at the time of the question. That's sort of just not a great omen in general. But at any rate, in this question, the judgment that comes through is going to be in terms of what's called an antitia. So we can see, for example, that Venus in the sign of Sagittarius is at 11 degrees, moving toward an antitia with Saturn, which is at 16 degrees Capricorn. If you don't know what an antitia is, it's an ancient form of aspect that has to do with similar degrees in signs where there will be a similar amount of light in the 24-hour day. So at 16 Capricorn, the equivalent degree in Sagittarius, where the same amount of light exists in the 24-hour day, is going to be about 14 Sagittarius. Venus is at about 12 Sagittarius, then moving into the antitia, which is a form of conjunction that ancient astrologers looked at. So in this case, we see the aspect being formed between the Lord of Death and the Father by antitia, with malefic Mars on the ascendant. So that's not great news. The other technique that we used in this case was, okay, first of all, we said, again, here's Father. And then we said, if we looked at the derived 8th house ruler, which sometimes astrologers will do, we go from the 8th house from the 4th house. So the 4th house becomes like house 1, house 5 would become house 2, and you count off like that around the wheel until you get to the 11th house, which is going to be the 8th from the 4th, the 8th from the house of Father. In that case, it's Mercury, because Virgo is on the derived 8th house cusp up there. And then what we see is that Mercury, Lord of the derived 8th house, is moving into a conjunction with the Sun. And the Sun is another natural symbol for Father. So it's a different story, but unfortunately similar. Not only that, but the moon is heading towards full, and the moon, when the light's opposed, it's generally not a good omen in horary. So this is a chart, just so that we understand why I'm doing this, where it was a pretty heavy situation. Father had suddenly fallen ill, wondered if everything was going to be okay. He'd gotten really intensely ill, hospitalized, didn't know what was wrong with him. And all indications from 3 different horaries, because we kept getting the time wrong, and this was a part of the previous video that I did, led to this final judgment that it looked like death was imminent. So, and then there was a timing procedure I won't go into. I heard from this young man in the new year that his father, after being diagnosed with stage 4, basically terminal cancer, had essentially had an accident. He had fallen, if I remember correctly, and then after a surgery, his brain function didn't come back, and he ended up dying in the hospital. So he actually didn't die of cancer. He actually died of if I remember correctly, like a heart attack or a stroke or something that came on after a fall that he took, due to, I guess, the weakness of the cancer in his body. But still, that's a really heavy story, right? I see this kind of stuff as an astrologer, more often than is comfortable. Like astrologers, in some way, if you're doing real karmic work and you're not just, in my opinion, if you're not just sort of blowing smoke up people's butt all the time, you see your fair share of really heavy stuff. I'm sure that psychics and other forms of readers out there can concur that, this is a karmic reality out there that, first of all, none of us leave here alive, right? Like, we're all going to die someday. And the way that we die is not always, in your sleep at 85 after a nice life. It sometimes it is, but often it's not. And not only that, but like all sorts of other difficult things happen that aren't just about death either. Lots of good things happen too, of course. You see those things as well. But when you're doing astrology long enough, the point is that you see difficult karma, and you really develop a kind of tolerance and acceptance for its reality. And learning to communicate that carefully, kindly, learning to read whether or not someone wants to or can handle that kind of news. Sometimes people will say, yeah, just tell me. And then you do a little probing, a little asking of questions, you realize something might really scare them. And so there's this other really intangible skill that astrologers have to either have or develop very carefully over time, which is knowing how much to share, when to share, what to share, and so forth. Learning to read your audience, and you make some mistakes as you go, and sometimes you say a little bit more than you should, and you know, people get a little scared. The point is not to scare people, right? But at the same time, you know, I think most people like listening to this might be surprised at how many people per year that I see ask really questions about really heavy stuff they're dealing with, and they really want to know. So astrology can be used carefully to give difficult, you know, to talk about difficult things that are happening. In this case, this young man's father just passed. This was, you know, one of those situations from start to finish where there was anxiety. There was anxiety about his health. The astrological judgment came back. There was anxiety about the judgment. Then his father passed. And what was the result? So in this young man's case, I'm just going to share a few of my observations about him and what I really admire about how he has handled this. First of all, I have to say that having spent some time in India and around Indian astrologers, speaking at an Indian astrology conference, and some deeper experience with the Indian astrological sort of ethos in general, this young man from India, generally speaking, seemed to have a greater respect or reverence for the reality of karma than many people, I would say, in the West generally do. And that's cultural, I think, right? Karma is more of a basic reality in India because it's been part of an accepted religious and spiritual belief system in India for thousands of years. So he took it pretty well, in my opinion. And there was a general sense of acceptance accompanying both the judgment and the reality of his father passing. Of course, he's dealing with real life emotions right now. It's not as if knowledge of this through astrology turns him off to a normal human grieving process. But what I observed in my interaction with him is that he is comforted knowing that this was karma, just trusting that this is destiny, and that this was divinely timed and divinely orchestrated. That's part of what the comfort of seeing difficult karma playing out reinforces, is ironically your sense of trust in the inherent destiny of all beings in all seasons of life. And it doesn't come without a certain amount of sort of fear and trembling. But that trust is, you know, it's like trust has to be gained and built. Astrology is helping us develop trust. It's normal when developing trust with like all of reality and the cosmos and the gods and the reality of the soul and divinity, for there to be some real trepidation. It's vastly bigger than we are, and it's scary, you know. So but it's also good, and it's also trustworthy, and astrology helps us to start building that trust. And with trust comes beauty. We start to see the beauty in things as well. So this second chart that I'm going to show you comes from my practice, and I did a video on this some time ago as well. I think it might have even been earlier in the fall, but at any rate, in this question, we are once again looking at a difficult karmic situation. Woman is asking, what will happen? I worded this incorrectly. What will happen for my marriage? Not your marriage. What will happen for her marriage? And I had to reword this to make it anonymous for her. And she was kind enough to let us use the chart on YouTube today. So at any rate, she was concerned that her marriage was falling apart. And that was all the information that we really started with. So in this case, you know, is there some kind of difficult event coming in our marriage? How do we judge this? Well, we give the querent is going to be represented by the ascendant ruler, which in this case, Cancer is on the ascendant. And so she's going to get the moon. That's her planet. She also, as a woman in a sort of heterosexual dynamic, gets Venus. That's one way that horary astrologers assigned planets in relationship questions. Granted that during their time, they weren't dealing with, they were dealing mostly, I would imagine, with heterosexual dynamics. So this system may be different when you're looking at non-sort of heterosexual relationship horaries, but it seems to work very well for ones that fall into that category. So she gets Moon and Venus. Anyway, then he gets the 7th house ruler, which is going to be Saturn, and he also gets the Sun. So these are our 4 players. And what we need to know essentially is how they feel about one another, and if they're going to make aspectual contact based on their receptions, what will happen. So when we look at that, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, how does the Moon feel about Saturn? Well, and this is a method that John Frawley made famous. He's a really great horary astrologer. The Moon is in Pisces, has no great essential like or dislike for Saturn in that sign. So there's the connection to Saturn. How about the Moon and the Sun? Well, the Moon in Pisces has doesn't do anything great or bad for the Sun either. So she's feeling neutral about him, we might say. Let's look at her other signifier, which is Venus. So here's Venus. How does Venus feel about his signifiers? And again, we see no great essential dignity. Sagittarius doesn't do anything negative or positive to the Sun or to Saturn. So meh. And that's actually how she described it. She was like, I wouldn't say that there's much there anymore. I'm kind of not greatly, I don't hate him. I don't feel like maybe I love him anymore either. There's this kind of neutral. So that's kind of what we would expect to see. Meanwhile, how does he feel? Whoops. Wrong one. Okay, here we go. So he's going to be represented by Saturn in this case. And how does he feel about the Moon? Well, Capricorn is the detriment of the Moon, so not great in that case. How about Venus? Well, nothing great or nothing negative toward Venus. So that's kind of one way of looking at it. Now, let's look at the Sun. How does the Sun feel about the Moon? That's his other signifier. Well, Scorpio is the fall of the Moon, so really not great about the Moon, which is one of her signifiers. How about Venus? Well, Scorpio is the detriment of Venus, so not great about Venus. So overall, we have some real dislike from him toward her in this situation, whereas from her toward him, it's neutral. That pretty much sums it up. He's not happy in the relationship. He's really not happy. She's neutral. And so then I noticed something else, though, and this is part of what we do in horary. Say, well, what is he interested in, right? Well, Saturn is in its own sign, so he's interested in himself. But Saturn also exalts Mars. How about the Sun? Well, the Sun is in Scorpio, which is the domicile of Mars. So Saturn and the Sun, his signifiers, are interested in themselves and in Mars. What is Mars? Well, we might notice in this horary that Mars is just separating from a square to Saturn. Mars in Libra exalts Saturn, while Saturn in Capricorn also exalts Mars, and they're just separating from contact with each other. So he's separating from something that he exalts and that exalts him. So in a situation like this, the horary astrologer is basically seeing the potential for something to really have his attention right now that also really likes him. In a situation where someone is really unhappy in a marriage, unfortunately, that includes the possibility of an affair, which means he could be really into someone that's really into him. They recently had some kind of connection. It's fading now, but that's where his interest lies. Now, there's some other things in here that we could discuss that are more, there's more details to discuss. But because of this, it dawned on me to ask the question, well, do you think, explaining these receptions, I said, do you think that it's possible that he's really distracted by someone or something right now that really has his attention? And that's when in the reading, she admitted that she's had a fear for a while that he has been having an affair. specifically having an affair in a in a fifth house environment. It would involve a particular kind of social environment. For example, the fifth house could be a bar that you always go to. The fifth house could be, you know, a bowling club that you belong to, or an online gaming community that you belong to. Anyway, it was this type of fifth house um, leisure club / environment that she suspected her husband was potentially having an affair with someone in. And so seeing the recent contact with Mars in such a house sort of, for me, started saying, okay, there might be something to this. Now, in a reading, I'm not going to say, oh, well, he's having an affair, because I don't know. It's just evidence, right? It's just stuff pointing in a direction. So in this case, we said, all right, you know, let's take a look at she had his birth chart and had his permission also to use his birth chart in a reading. He was like, yeah, I don't think he really exactly knew what she was doing, but sorry, move my bottle of water out of the way. He was like, you know, no, I don't know, you know, like probably didn't know that she was, you know, trying to figure out what was going on in their marriage down to that level. But she's like, yeah, you know, he knows that I'm concerned about the relationship. I can look at his chart. So let's take a look at his chart. So, all right. So here is his chart, which we looked at. And we just said, okay, well, you know, is there anything going on in his chart right now that would suggest something big happening in the marriage department? Which is just, you know, just to say, not is he having an affair, but just, you know, is there an event coming in love right now that, you know, might be more concerning? And the ruler, so we look in this chart to the ruler of the seventh house of marriage, and that is the planet Jupiter, ruler of Pisces. And we notice right away that the transiting Saturn was coming into a conjunction with the ruler of the house of marriage within about 3 degrees at this time. So, or well, maybe it was a little bit more than that, 4 or 5 degrees. But imminently, Saturn, Lord of Karma, coming into a conjunction with ruler of the house of marriage. Okay, so that's a little heavy. We also notice that in the next couple of years, there's a couple of other concerning transits. Neptune will go across the descendant critical degree in the house of marriage and will square Venus, natural ruler of love. And that's happening in the next couple of years. So 2 imminent transits coming around the topic of love and relationships, Saturn to 7th house ruler, and then Neptune over the descendant and square to Venus. So that was like, okay, there is some evidence that your relationship is, you know, maybe about to go through a little, you know, a period of upheaval, you could say. And then what we wanted to look on is then say, okay, well, let's just check your chart, you know, just to be safe. Like, let's see if anything's coming in your chart, because that would really tell us then that something's cooking here. So looking at her chart, we can see, you look at the typical things that you would look at would be the 7th house ruler, as well as Venus. Well, yep, Saturn and Pluto are imminently moving into a conjunction with her natal Venus. We don't see the 7th house ruler getting especially lit up. But another thing that's happening is next summer, we have eclipses rolling into her marriage house. So eclipses rolling into the marriage house within the next year, and in the next 2 years on timeline with his Venus Neptune transit. We also have Pluto coming over her natal Venus. So yes, something's imminent. Now back to the horary. Do we see anything in the horary that suggests an imminent event coming? Well, yeah, we do. We see her signifier, the moon, going into a trine with his signifier, the sun. The sun is in the fall of the moon, which means there'll be contact and it will probably let her down. Then the moon goes right into a sextile with Saturn, his other signifier, who's in the sign of her detriment. Yeah, let down. So that's not particularly promising altogether. So we said imminent event in marriage could be very soon, could be sometime in the next 2 years. And you might as well, if you feel like your intuition is telling you that there's something going on, you might just want to talk to him about it. So that's where we left things. Now, I got a letter from her right around the same time that I got a letter from the young man from India saying that indeed, although if I remember correctly, I don't have the email verbatim in my head, but although they were not able to talk anything out and get anywhere through talking, she did end up discovering that he's been having an affair and then asked for a divorce. So that process, she said, could take a couple of years because of their assets and so forth. But the sad news is that obviously the sad news of the situation is that the marital affair was indeed true. The good news is that because the astrology in some ways tipped her off to it, she was able to, she tried to confront him. Nothing came of that, if I'm remembering correctly. And then the second piece was she ended up finding some evidence that that's what was happening anyway. And that led to her asking for the divorce, which now could take a couple of years. So that's a heavy thing, right? Now, I promise you, there are babies being born, there are job promotions, there's finding healing, there are redemptive experiences, there are breakthroughs. I see that stuff too, right? So it's not just like, oh God, it sounds kind of, it's like a dismal situation to talk about these charts. But the simple point is that this is a part of the reality of astrology, is that astrology predicts and helps people deal with heavy karma, difficult karmic passages in life. Just like there's sunshine and there's rain, there are sunny karmic patterns and there's hail. You know what I mean? So they come through. Sometimes they're mixed. Sometimes it's a little, it's like a double rainbow in the middle of a rainstorm or something like that, And so, but that's it. How did this woman deal with this? Well, she was comforted knowing that astrology confirmed her intuition. So she didn't have to feel crazy anymore. Because if you know what it's like to have an intuition about something and to just need it validated, if astrology can do that without sort of meddling in other people's business or digging up dirt or something like that, then it's amazing that astrology can help people confirm things, such as this guy's trying to sell me a car and I feel like there's something wrong with the car, or he's lying to me. Is the car in good shape? No, the car is not in good shape. Thank you. I don't feel crazy. This guy was trying to make me feel crazy. You see what I mean? And I've done that. I've actually done that horary a bunch of times in my career. And sometimes it's like, no, the car's fine. But the point is that if astrology can confirm your intuition that something's coming, something relevant, deep, difficult, your intuition is your soul speaking to you. It's in astrological and yogic terms, it's Paramatma, the God who lives in your heart, who is like your conscience, speaking to you and guiding you in the right direction. And these larger karmic laws sometimes just mirror back that, look, you're intelligent. You have intuition about what's right and wrong, about how to act, about what kind of karmic reality you're dealing with here. And astrology confirming that, even if it's difficult, is so deeply valuable. And that was one of the things that I noticed that she got from this reading. The other thing that was there for her was getting up the confidence to get out of a relationship that she was meh about and that he was totally out of. And so even if it was heavy, that heaviness brought about a kind of breakthrough. And now she's feeling not great, but starting a path to freedom, I imagine. So I mean, the freedom, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's got to be freeing on some level to get out of a situation that's toxic, right? So not that we want to call anybody a toxic person, because the reasons for these karmic encounters are, we have to be careful not to judge people, right? Like, just because someone's in my work as an astrologer, just because I see husband might be having an affair, I have no idea why he's having an affair or how complicated it could be or what wounding he might have or whatever. So it's not like, we try to use this information to create more of a soap opera in people's lives. But anyway, it was comforting to know that this event in her life was also a part of her karmic destiny, knowing that it wasn't a bad event, that it was a divine event. that shift in consciousness matters when you're going through heavy karma. This stuff sounds like, 101, like we should all know it. Yet, as we're coming into a lunar eclipse in Cancer and, Saturn, Pluto conjoining with Mercury and the Sun, it feels sometimes like there's a lot to be depressed or worried about. And how do you deal with that? Okay, so there's two examples of heavy karma, heavy results, but how it ended up being okay for these people. So I wanted to use some basic examples to start with. Now I want to speak a little bit more philosophically. I want to look at the two words that I saw repeated in all the emails I got, which were depressing or afraid or fear. So I love etymologies. I think etymologies are one of the, it's just sort of one of the best ways to understand the consciousness behind the words that we use. So let's take a look at the word fear, first of all. It comes from the Old English, which means calamity, sudden danger, peril, sudden attack. So oftentimes what's really going on when we fear something is that, especially in astrology, more particularly astrology, that's what I want to speak to anyway. We fear that something sudden, dangerous, something will attack us, take us by surprise. And we have the sense of being, there's old Saxon etymological connection to the idea of being ambushed, being deceived, being in danger. So basically, being ambushed, being suddenly attacked, or being in danger is basically, behind that is the idea that something could suddenly happen to us that could deeply harm us, and that inherently things are not trustworthy. Okay, so that's legitimate, right? Like we're biological beings here. We're spirit souls, but we're in a biological jumpsuit here, and we're dealing with a biological reality that includes things that can suddenly happen and harm you. So it's not illogical to feel this way. It's not irrational. It's about the possibility of something happening in the future. But isn't it interesting that this word also has the sense of something lying in wait, like we just said, but also reverence, revering something, or even worshiping something, or it has also the sense of respecting something, or holding it in high esteem. If you think about fear, there's a way in which fear possesses us, right? It possesses us, and then we become sort of fixated on the potential for something to be lying in wait, or to ambush us, or to harm us or hurt us, right? And so we get sort of fixated on that. And then in a sense, fear has this component of revering something. Like if you've ever dealt with, someone who's really, really like angry, or someone who is, I don't know, like one time I was at a baseball game, and I was walking out of the park, and there was a drunk guy who was really, really belligerent. And he started talking to me, like venting, like he's so pissed off about this or that. He was drunk. And I just remember sort of like, suddenly he was like a mad king that I was like revering, and sort of like, okay, like I just don't want this guy to like go off on me. You know what I mean? And there was this funny way afterwards where I was like, I feel like I became a different person in the way that I sort of revered and sort of feared him, and like sort of cowered in myself, like internally, though externally it wouldn't have looked any different to anyone. I was just sort of, I guess, pacifying him, or being pleasant or something. But internally I was like, ooh, like that guy's freaking me out right now, right? So similarly, there is this sense in which that which we fear, we revere. There's a kind of, oh, like that. And sometimes reverence and fear in religious or spiritual life has positive connotations as well, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But mostly what this word fear has to do with is linked to the sense that something could happen that's bad, that something is not trustworthy, that something is lying in wait, could take us by surprise, that's off script somehow that, you know, jumps out of the bushes, and that we then, if we become fixated on it, we become sort of like reverent of it, and it changes us, and it puts us into a state that is not pleasant, right? We feel like we've lost ourselves in it somehow. We become possessed by it. Okay, now the other word, depression, I think this is really interesting because in astronomy, one of its first original meanings is the angular distance of a star below the horizon. And I think it also means to press down. An angular star below the horizon, right? An angular star below the horizon would mean one that has not yet risen or one that has just set. That's the first or the seventh house in our birth charts. And which means that you're either trying to rise up against the feeling of pressure or the weight of the world, so to speak. You're trying to rise up, but you've from a place that's pressed down, or it has the feeling of having been in a position of power or strength or centeredness, but having been pushed down and losing it, as in the case of a star setting in the seventh house being angular, but being pushed down. So I was thinking about that and just creatively playing with those images and thinking, you know, the very idea of being pressed down. I mean, there's a whole history of the depression and melancholy in just human temperament that's really interesting. I'm not going to go into that so much, but just the idea of being pressed down, having to struggle to rise up against some influence, starry influence, karmic influence, or some karmic influence smashing you down. Either way, the feeling of depression is like, oh, there's this weight, and it's either pushing me down or I have to struggle up against it. So those two words together are pretty intense, right? If you think about fear and depression, it's like, okay, well, on the one hand, I'm waiting, I'm alert to something that could be lying in wait, and I'm sort of freaking out about it. Or I feel like I'm trying to rise up against some kind of influence that's trying to press me down, right? In either case, inherently, what are we seeing? We're seeing ourselves and a reality outside of ourselves that are opposed and untrustworthy, and maybe even evil or malefic. So there's a reason that we have malefic planets in astrology, and there's a reason that we have bad karma in astrology, and there is a reason that we have things that press you down that you have to struggle to rise up against. And there is a reason in astrology that sometimes things like lie in wait and sort of attack you. And the reason for it is that astrology is the language of astrology is reflective of our experiences in the material world. And in the material world, things can jump out, things can ambush, things can harm. In the material world, things can press you down. You have to try to rise up against those. The reason that that language is in astrology is because it is a part of reality. It's a part of what we deal with in the everyday walk of life. And everything that we deal with in the everyday walk of life is represented somewhere in the language of astrology, because the language of astrology is meant to connect the everyday changes and fluctuations of karma with eternal patterns and realities, which were thought of as the thoughts in the mind of God. Okay, now let's shift over to this other word, worship, which comes close to the word fear, to revere something. People will ask, how do you deal with the depression of these heavy transits, or how do you deal with the, the anxiety or the fear that comes up with them? Let's talk about the word worship, which is in many ways a much better word than the word fear, but they have something in common. The word worship, again, comes Anglican, Saxon, etc., a condition of being worthy. A condition of being worthy. Worthy of what? Dignity, glory, distinction, honor, renown, attention. Something being honorable and worthy of our select attention. Okay, so one of the things that one of my spiritual teachers often says is, where attention goes, energy flows. It's a simple concept. Most people are familiar with it. What I like that gets linked to this in at least the Bhakti Yoga tradition and in many other traditions is that our attention is our worship. We don't like to think about the word worship, most of us, because, excuse me, it is, for many of us, it's hard for our egos to think about like getting on our knees and like, oh, like, you know, we have these kind of ridiculous pictures of what it means to worship something. And the idea also that usually comes up is like, well, you know, I worship myself. I'm worthy of worship. I'm not some idiot who's stupid and I have to worship something bigger than myself. I'm also sacred. So our sort of Western egos really recoil at the notion of worship. But worship is so common and so basic and so much more about where we place our attention. People worship football. People worship the news cycle. People worship, you know, their bank account. People worship their children. People worship their spouse. People worship themselves. You know, people worship anything that they're constantly giving their attention to. So, first of all, fear and worship go together, because when we start worshiping something, it becomes the object of attachment. And when we worship things in the material world, the world of karma, fear naturally goes along with that, because we're afraid that we won't get what we are attached to with our attention. We're fixated on something, we're afraid that we won't get it, or if we have it, we're afraid it will be taken away. Or when we have it, we get afraid that we will mismanage it or lose it somehow. If you're a parent, you know what this is like. You know, if you're a business owner, you know what this is like. And so mostly what we worship is karma. Karma meaning the great rotating wheel of stories in the material world that are based on changing events and outcomes and circumstances. We give all of our attention to it, and therefore we worship it. And along with it comes the fear or anxiety, the reverence of it, because of the power it starts to have over us because of the degree of worship we give it. The unfortunate thing is most of the things that we grow attached to in the material world, that we give our faithful, adoring, worshipful attention to, is that they are not worthy of worship because they don't reciprocate with love, right? In fact, most of the things that we worship are intangible and sort of illusory. This is why this material world is often referred to as Maya, or, you know, illusion, or samsara. Like, you worship all of these things that are about your business or about your marriage or your career or your money or your, you know, your kids or whatever. And often enough, the things that you're fixated on are in your head. They're not even necessarily real, or nothing ends up coming of the things that you obsess over. So they're not necessarily worthy of worship. And this is what's meant in many regards by the idea of the idols of the mind, the idolatrous thoughts that we kind of fixate on. So one of the things that helps us is to reorient what we worship, right? And astrology is actually meant to be a part of the reorientation of our attention and our worship. And I use that word to be a little provocative, to get people to think a little differently about what we're doing with our mental and emotional energy. So the truth is that we worship whatever we give our attention to. Whatever we fear or revere is often also what we are worshiping. Whatever we are investing our hopes in terms of particular future outcomes, or in terms of potential things in the future that could take away things that we feel that we have now, whatever things we're wishing or hoping for in the future. And so the truth is that this means that most of us are worshiping karma, that we are worshiping the constant flux and impermanent change of events. And this reality doesn't reciprocate very nicely. This reality is full of things that jump out and take away, because the nature of this karmic field is impermanence. So sometimes it does so in ways that are really malicious. Sometimes it does so in ways that are really natural and not that malicious. But for sure, the objects of our worship in a realm of change are fleeting, and therefore they can't reciprocate in the way that we're looking for. Why? Because ancient astrologers tell us that we are eternal spirit souls, and eternal spirit souls are looking for attachments and things that are worshipful that are also eternal, because then they have the capacity to eternally reciprocate, to fill our hearts with love, real attachment connection. So astrology starts in the ancient world with the recognition that we are all attached to and tend to worship the shrines of karma, the idols of the mind, and that this is what we're doing. Now, to this extent, we are either worshiping Maya or illusion or lots of temporary things that can't reciprocate, like we said. And then not only that, but when we first start getting interested in astrology, we upgrade a little bit. We start realizing, like, oh, wow, astrology is like this amazing, powerful technology that can tell us about the realm of karma, and it might also start helping us manipulate that realm of karma a little bit, right? So we might start, for example, we realize that the ones orchestrating the karmic reality are the planets to a certain extent. Symbolically, they're the gods that are like the housekeepers of the karmic realm. Their movements mirror the stream of karmic changes. So we start worshiping them. Maybe that's a step up, right? We're like, okay, now I'm like, okay, this god, that god, I start relating to, trying to worship, trying to get in with somehow. But it's still basically because I'm worshiping at the altar of all of the different changing karmic fields that I'm attached to, that I've given my full attention to. Okay. Now, the study of astrology originally is designed to be a medicine for our attachment to the karmic reality, including even attachment to worshiping the gods that dictate that reality, because that just shows a slightly higher level of understanding about how that reality is working. Now, this is the way that astrology is explained both implicitly and explicitly in, whether you're talking about the Pythagoreans or the Platonists, or you're talking about the yogis, even to a certain extent, Buddhists and Stoics, they have some very different philosophies, but that's how it's discussed. So how is astrology like a medicine? Well, medicines, if you know anything about herbal medicine, they're bitter, right? Like they don't often taste good. Like you can develop a taste for herbs. Like my wife is like, she'll slam an herbal, tincture or whatever. And I was like, oh my God, that tastes awful. But, I know what it's like to be able to develop some kind of taste for bitter medicine after, drinking ayahuasca for 10 years of my life. The medicine doesn't taste good going down. The Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, tells us specifically that which tastes good in the beginning will come out bad later. But that which doesn't taste good in the beginning, real spiritual knowledge, doesn't taste great in the beginning, but over time comes out very nicely. There's something about this that is generally true about spiritual practice and spiritual medicine in any walk of life. Shamans will tell you this. Yogis will tell you this. Even Christ talks about how you have to, he's taking a young person along with him, and he's worried about leaving his family. And he says, let the dead bury the dead. You've got to cut some ties to take off on spiritual life. And it's painful. It's not always easy. This guy has to leave his family behind. It's not always easy to do such things. And it doesn't have to be that dramatic, right? But anyway, so it's a medicine. At first, we're fascinated with astrology because it validates and gives us insight into the feeling that we're in this very magical sphere of constantly rotating circumstances, the realm of fortune, the realm of karma. It's an enticing and alluring reality. It's beautiful because it's divinely made. It's not a bad place. It's just a real place. It's a divine, real place. However, it's constantly shifting and constantly changing. And in that sense, it's transient, and there's nothing that's easily held on to. You can't, it's like trying to, worship one place in a river. It's always changing. It's never the same thing twice. You can't give your attention fully to it and expecting that it will be able to reciprocate with full attention to you, because it's always in flux. So, we know that meditation practices basically tell us the exact same thing. The Yoga Sutras tell us the exact same thing. Over time, what we're doing when we study astrology is slowly purging ourselves of worship and focus and attention being given to the karmic realm. It is slow, it is very gradual, it can, and it's not just astrology, all different manners of spiritual life can do it, but astrology is unique because astrology is a karmic science. So astrology is showing us the weather patterns of karma, the ups and downs of karma, what's happening, specifically so that we can start to wean ourselves from worshiping it, meaning giving our attention to it. Our attention, by attention, I don't mean that we taking our attention away from it. I don't mean that we ignore it, give it the cold shoulder, deny that it's there, deem it as evil. Actually, any of those things would be to continue in attachment to it. Real detachment from it means that we become more reflective, passive observers and participants, right? It's like fighting against the stream in a river, realizing if you turn around the other way, you can flow with it. Astrology is helping us over time to relinquish attachments to the worshipable objects of karma. And as it purges us of that, it goes through two general stages. The first stage is the one in which it will amplify, make sort of and exaggerate our attachments to the karma. And that's where we get the anxiety and depression from. When we hear the difficult transits coming, we get depressed, we get anxious, etc. That anxiety and that depression, if you are studying astrology in earnest with an open heart and an open mind, is a good sign in a sense. I'm not trying to glorify depression or fear or anything like that. It's a good sign because it means that what you're starting to see reflected back in karma is exactly the kind of negative feedback that we need to start shifting our attention away from our attachment to those results, to those streams and weather patterns. But it doesn't happen overnight. You have to, in some ways, live through the ups and the downs of karma while continuing to be a student of astrology over a long period of time before you start to recognize that some degree of receptive observance and detachment from the karmic field is possible and actually feels better. So you have to weather that storm. And the difficult thing is that our world is not set up to give most people that support when it comes to doing astrology. In fact, most of the way that astrology is done in popular culture is about doubling down on your investment in the karmic field, which is why you end up hearing so many super positivistic uses of the language of astrology. It's specifically because astrology is being used as a way of furthering your investment in the worshipable objects of karma. That's why it becomes so positive. When real astrology is meant to take you out of the cycle of being positively or negatively attached to those objects of karma, right? So we don't have a great setup or a support system for people when they're going through the process of learning and studying astrology for them to develop this sense that, the depression and the fear is a healthy part of the process. Let's talk about it. Let's help you through it. There's not that support set up in a lot of places. If you get involved in certain communities, it's more likely that you'll find that support. But insofar as the astrological community is trying to help you double back down on interpreting the transits in terms of more favorable karmic results, they're only using astrology to amplify an idolatrous worship of karma, which doesn't really get you anywhere because that karma, again, can't reciprocate to you on the level of the heart. It just can't. It will do so, maybe it will appear to do so for a period of time when things are going good. It'll throw you back into the same confusion and disillusionment and fear and anxiety and depression when it doesn't. Depression and fear are natural as well. So it's also not about ultimately getting rid of any human emotion or any kind of human experience. It's putting us in right relationship to it. That astrology is there to help us get into right relationship with all emotions and all experiences. But so, for example, there is some sense in which being generally a little depressed by like dark weather is good for the soul, because the soul likes what's real, and we need contrast. Contrast is necessary for love in the same way that two people and the choice to come together is necessary for love. Separation is necessary for love. Similarly, contrast of emotions and experiences are necessary for soulfulness, because the soul wants to experience reality. The difference is that, when we have holy depression, holy fear, holy happiness, etc., we're understanding them as we're understanding their eternal nature for what they are. For example, when you go through a Saturn transit and you have a healthy perspective of Saturn, you might feel fear, depression, heaviness, anxiety, dread. Those things can come up. But because you know that Saturn is a divine thought in the mind of God, your relationship shifts with it. The suffering becomes holy, and the soul, believe it or not, actually likes to suffer if it's holy. Do you know what I mean? This is why God comes into the flesh, quote unquote, as Jesus, and suffers a horrible death. The point of that story, which is repeated in different forms of mythology, is that divinity is okay with suffering. It's part of what makes everything whole. So astrology is not necessarily about detaching us from the objects of karma and then putting us into some neutral state where we never experience anything. It's about shifting our relationship with what we're experiencing so that we understand it as an eternal, holy experience, rather than the anxiety-ridden material experience that's fleeting and transient and can't reciprocate on the level of the heart and soul. That's a shift in consciousness that happens as we relate to astrology over a long period of time. And again, ride with the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows. Now, this is why my personal opinion is that you can't really do astrology and get the most out of it. And it's going to be a lot more topsy-turvy and difficult to deal with those twists and turns if you don't have some kind of devotional or spiritual practice and lifestyle. The reason for this is that taking your attention away from something doesn't work alone, because you still have attention and you have to put it somewhere. So if you don't reorient your attention and your worship to something that is positive in a sense, like that's something that can actually reciprocate with you, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're just going to be trying to constantly pull back from attachment to things, but that's wearying and exhausting, because the natural state of the soul, endogenous to the soul, is the need to attach and the need to connect and the need to love and be loved. So you can't just withdraw from the karmic realm. You have to reorient your attention so that where attention goes, energy flows, but now it's going to that which is transcendental, that which is eternal, that which is divine, which is weirdly co-present. It's here. It's in all of the karmic stuff. It just takes a shift of consciousness to shift your attention from the literalness of the transient material events and outcomes to their supernatural, divine, eternal essence. That's what Plato was talking about when he said we're learning to see the forms. The Hermeticists were talking about when they said we're learning to see the thoughts in the mind of God. The yogis also see these as the operating forces of karma, and it can generate respect for the beauty of the universe and the divine sort of intelligence of God. So we need some way of reorienting that attention. It doesn't just go away. And in my opinion, there are, my guru's guru once said that there are many names and processes by which one can give their heart and soul to God, to the divine. But one should take one up. That's the basic message. That's the evangelism. That's the knocking on people's door being like, you know, throughout the history of the world, that this is why religious and spiritual life gets spread, because we see people who are worshiping at the altar of karma and we go like, you're suffering, dude. You know, I'm suffering from it too. We're also in, but there's a different way. You can reorient your attention and give yourself your attention and your worship to something that is more worthy. And that's not, you know, again, I don't want to be prescriptive about that. In Krishna Bhakti, that's Krishna and Radha, that, and there's all different, there's chanting, there's kirtan, there's, you know, association with saintly people. There's all different ways that in Bhakti yoga, we talk about how to do that. But as someone who was a yoga studio owner for almost 10 years, what I've noticed is that renunciation, or just trying to withdraw from karmic attachments, doesn't work alone. You have to have something else to put your attachment into, because the heart and soul don't go away and they're looking to connect and attach. That's why the word yoga means to link, to join. That's why the word religion, from the Latin, I believe, religio, means to reconnect. And it has the idea of almost like a severed tendon, something that's there that should be connecting us. So the proper form of connection is what we're looking for. Astrology, alongside of a spiritual practice of some kind of reorientation of our attention that can redirect energy in a positive way, together, that bitter medicine at first, where there's some fear and depression around these heavier times, it lifts. It eventually does lift. It's not going to go away completely, because then the blessings and benefits of those emotions would go away, and they're vast and amazing. But we can trust that even though there's maybe, you know, something lying in wait that we're afraid of, we know that whatever it is that's lying in wait, from the eternal perspective, is good, is beautiful, is true, and is holy. We know that if something presses us down, that it's good, beautiful, true, and holy, while also pressing us down and potentially being terrifying or depressive and, you know, heavy. So it's we see more than the literal thing that's in front of us. We start seeing with divine eyes. Astrology is meant to help us do that, but it takes this perspective along with cultivation of our attachment to higher things. This language is a karmic science that's meant to complement and go along with yoga in India, right? As is Ayurveda, the medicinal practice. Similarly, acupuncture and Taoism. You know, there are sciences that go along with a spiritual path in life. A sign of a sick society is, you know, really, in some ways, a sick spiritual society, a sick any society, is one that takes an amazing spiritual science that's meant to help us get out of karma, and instead tends to use it as a way of doubling down and getting more enmeshed in our attachments to karma. And it's, to some extent, that's what pop astrology is. The results, of course, of which are dumbed down, watered down astrology in some cases, that is not giving us an accurate view of karma, that's trying to delude us to maintain some form of denial, you know, that oh, this stuff really makes me happy. Like, no, it doesn't actually. But we create super positivistic astrology that denies the heavier side of karma, specifically because we're trying to use the study to invest more deeply in those forms of attention, those forms of worship. So I hope that this has been helpful for all of you today. Even if you study astrology and you don't have a particularly developed spiritual practice, if you can just try to continually open your heart to love in your life, in your relationships, as well as acceptance, curiosity, surrender to what comes. Astrology is a language that will help you develop your soul. Your soul will start to come out, and your soul is game for all of it. Because you have to remember, from this standpoint, your soul is never born and never dies. The soul is like, I'm game. You know, what really kills the soul, it can't be killed, but what really kills the soul is investment in things that aren't real, that are transient, and that can't reciprocate. That depersonalizes the soul. And there's nothing more offensive than being objectified, especially by ourselves. So at any rate, that's what I've got for you guys. Little sermon from the stars. I hope that you're having a nice start to your week. Don't be freaked out by these transits. Let's all do it together. We'll just hold each other's hands. It's like Ram Dass said, we're all just walking each other home. Okay, take care, everyone.